It is Wednesday, my dudes, and you know what that means. It is time once again to revisit Neptune Park, a Planet Coaster series in which I make a park called Neptune Park. We are going to be constructing a racetrack, a go-kart track, if you will, once I've finished looking around the park, admiring it, and deciding where I want the racetrack to be before ultimately deciding I should probably go in this part of the park, which currently only has this one roller coaster, which you can watch the construction and POV of in last week's episode in the playlist by clicking the playlist link in the description or at the end of this video. Just got to plug this series, of course. You know, got to plug the series that you're currently watching, right? So here we are, struggling. This was actually the second attempt at building a racing track. A racing track? A racetrack? Is racing track even a correct term? It sounds wrong saying it, and I think racetrack is the more popular version, but I personally do like a good underdog story, so if and that includes supporting underdog lexicon. So yeah, this was actually a second attempt of me designing the layout. The first time I did it, I wasn't a big fan. I kind of looked towards, first things first, I looked at real racing tracks on Google Images, but I think the problem is that most real racing tracks are designed for the scale of, you know, real racing cars. So then I turned to go-kart tracks, but most of them I'm not a big fan of. They're very compact sort of things. A lot of the times they're set inside or kind of in what was clearly a former parking lot or car park for people from real countries. Shots fired there. I was about to make a gun control joke then, but then I hesitated and decided not to. But then I thought I didn't really want a go-kart looking go-kart track, if that makes sense. I want it to look like a racing track that's just on a smaller scale. So after looking at a few different kind of smaller racing tracks from Europe and places, I didn't really like the look of any of them. Again, even though they were smaller and miniaturized, they were still kind of built to the scale of full cars. So then I decided to look at slot cars. Like slot car tracks, not you know your standard Scalextric things you can buy in the shop, but like proper ones where you might see in like a amusement park or like an arcade or something, like a properly built slot car track. And there are some nice layouts out there. And in fact, this whole track I'm designing, including the general aesthetics of it, was based upon a slot car track that I saw, like a slot car table. So it was all very professionally done, painted and modelled and all that. So in the end, I actually really like the way this came out. One of the tricks I do when I'm looking at kind of muses to build stuff in Planet Coaster is I look at model train stuff or just model scenery, because a lot of stuff you get to, because Planet Coaster doesn't look, it's a fairly realistic looking game, but I think you agree it's not photorealistic, right? It has this kind of charming cartoony aesthetic, which ultimately I think works better for it because it will age a lot better, first things first. I mean, I don't know. The example I like to use for cartoony graphics is you look at like The Legend of Zelda. If you look at like Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild, you know, those games still, well, Breath of the Wild is quite new, but Wind Waker came out years ago, and it still does hold up, aside from the fact it's in 4:3 aspect ratio, and it's not HD. The graphics, they hold up, whereas something like Twilight Princess has not aged well. I don't even get me started on Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, which by today's standards look like origami. I think that whole generation of consoles like PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 have just not aged particularly well. But all that aside, Planet Coaster, as I was saying, it's kind of that sort of side of things where it looks a little bit cartoonish. So buildings in this game based on real life buildings can sometimes be a little bit tricky, and they end up looking a little bit overbuilt, if that makes sense. Like they look a little bit too detailed, or I don't know, it's hard to match the look. But model trains, on the other hand, the buildings there, the scale they're built at and the level of detail they have end up translating quite well to the aesthetics of Planet Coaster. And the same thing goes for a slot car scenery, because I guess it's kind of the same vein of sort of stuff, and that is that kind of hobby thing. So that's kind of what I looked at when building this track, and the surrounding buildings and this bridge. So there was, like I say, there was one table which I did spend a good, must have been a good 5 minutes Googling before I recorded this video, trying to find the source so I could link it to the description, and I couldn't find it for the life of me. So if I find it prior to releasing this video, I'll link it in the description, but I wouldn't get your hopes up, kids, I'm sorry. By the way, I know I said at the beginning this Wednesday my dues, but I think it's an established fact, part of the canon of this series, that it is not actually recorded on a Wednesday for the most part. Sometimes I record it in a week in advance when I'm trying to be efficient, but that's not, you know, I'm not usually very efficient, so usually it's recorded on Tuesday or Monday, but it's Monday for me. And Monday right now is the 5th of November, which is Bonfire Night in the United Kingdom. And I don't know if it's just like a thing where it's happened in other countries, a bit like Black Friday in America, although other American things like Thanksgiving haven't really spread anywhere, I don't think. At least not in Europe, which is where I'm familiar with. But yeah, it's November the 5th, which is Bonfire Night, or all that thing that V for Vendetta talks about, for those of you who don't know. But one of the traditions of Bonfire Night is to A, light bonfires, as one might expect, but it's also setting off fireworks. So you may hear, luckily this microphone is very good at picking up things that are close to it, but not so much things far away. Like if I stand back, the drop off for my voice is quite dramatic. I stood back and then knocked my chair over because I didn't look behind me, but you can hear the drop, so it's quite good at not picking up anything that's not immediately in front of it, but still, you may hear the odd sort of faint boom in the background. That's why. I'm not actually under terrorist attack, don't worry. I haven't been swatted. It's just that there are fireworks going outside, so that's kind of something that you might hear going on, but hopefully not. Hopefully it's not too intrusive. Further to this, my computer has been rather loud recently because it's coming up to that time when there's quite a lot of dust building up inside it. My computer case, it's a Corsair 750D Airflow edition, if that means anything to people. I mean, if you have a case of the same series, I guess, but it's got like a pop-off front panel that you can just wipe all the dust off and then clip it back on. So usually I just do that. I run that under a tap to get rid of all the dust, dry it off whilst I'm and I'll leave it to like dry whilst I'm at work, and I'll put it on when I'm back. So like that's kind of how I clean my PC most of the time. But then every 6 months or so, I have like an electric air duster. I used to use canned air, but I don't really like using it because obviously it runs out eventually, so over the course of my lifetime, which I hope is going to be another 700 years, we'll have cracked immortality by then, it'll end up costing more money, even though the electric ones are more expensive up front. But also the cans aren't very nice to use. Like, you ideally need to buy two, not so much because of the fact that if you run out, it'll be annoying if you don't have a second one, but the fact that as you use canned air, it gets very, very cold. Like, you have to wear gloves, basically, so people recommend you have two, so when one gets too unbearably cold to use and hold, you can switch to the other one. And also, I used to have canned air, like I say, and it would sometimes spit out, like, residue, like liquid, when I'm cleaning, which is not too bad because the piece is obviously off, and I'll wipe all the, like, fluid away, and it's admittedly not very much, but still, it's a bit inconvenient. So, this was a very long tangent, by the way, but yeah, I have an air dust, so every 6 months or so, I'll take my PC outside and just give it a blast with the old air dust, although I'm about to move house. And I'll be getting cleaners to come and clean this room. Well, my landlord will get cleaners to come and clean this room very thoroughly, regardless of the state it's in. So I'll have to, but I'm going to be obligated to pay for that, I'm sure. So I'll probably just dust it in here, and the cleaners can dust it off. I hope that I get my deposit back. I haven't done any damage, but I did flick, I don't know how. I think I was eating chips or fries for you Americans, and I dipped one in some ketchup and rather dramatically flicked it towards my face and flicked ketchup on the wall. I don't know how I did this, to be honest. I'm actually quite impressed. Actually, just talk about the footage very quickly. Funny, I know. I realised my error in constructing these little garages by the side of the track, because I realised that actually the Planet Coaster cars are the wrong scale for it. I mean, it kind of makes sense because the go-karts themselves are the right size. So I ended up putting just Knight Rider cars here, and I thought just by placing them like this, it won't be immediately obvious that the garage doors are too small to accommodate those cars. But, you know, they could accommodate the go-karts. And I guess it could even serve as like an actual functional garage. Like at night, the go-karts could legitimately be stored in here. So this building kind of, again, was inspired by the kind of things you see at the side of a racetrack. The stand, I don't know if there's a proper word for it, I guess, control building, because I guess it's not the stands, is it? It's because there's no seating in here. But I guess, I don't know, the VIP lounge. I did toy with the idea of putting a restaurant in this upper bit, but that was just a lot of effort, to be honest. You know me, I don't like doing interiors. So I just put this kind of blue arch shapes here to emulate the look of glass. So that was that. But again, this was built inspired off a model that was used on a slot car track. Because again, models look quite good. I think this was more for Crimson Tower, not so much Neptune Park. But Crimson Tower actually looked a lot let's slow down and talk properly. I looked a lot at the modular Lego sets, you know, the modular Lego buildings. Because again, Lego's quite a good scale. I did this with Mirror Lake as well, actually. God, that series was a long time ago, wasn't it? I did that for Mirror Lake as well. I looked at Lego models and then translated those. These days I don't. I tend to either look at models, like for model train sets or things like that, or I will look at real life buildings, and just, you know, I'm now familiar enough with Planet Coaster's building tools that I can kind of translate that into something that would look good in Planet Coaster rather than just making it a one-to-one recreation, which a good example of this would be the entrance building of this park. I wouldn't say it's based on anything because it doesn't really look like anything, but the color scheme and the brickwork and the general look of it was based on this like nature center in the UK, as in like a nature reserve place. There was an eco bit at the front. Obviously it was much smaller than the Neptune Park building, but the actual architectural style was based off it anyway. So yes, I feel like actually I haven't mentioned this yet, but this is a Knight Rider themed go-kart track. No reason really, other than the fact I wanted an excuse to put the Knight Rider car in, and I quite like the Knight Rider aesthetic that we've got all these custom signs. That was it really. I wanted to make a custom sign, but didn't really want to make a custom sign. And the game does have custom signs, but they're only for like specific brands. I'm like, well, we can just use what was it called? The Knight Rider. I did just totally forget about the thing I was talking about. The Knight Rider go-kart set, which is part of a DLC, and then that just lets me use the custom Knight Rider signs. I don't have to worry about naming this anything creative. So that was the beginning and end of that. I think in hindsight, I would have probably preferred to have DeLoreans, but you know, the DeLorean, I feel like I would have had to justify it by having some sort of time travel aesthetic, like maybe have fire or like a lightning special effect as you race around the track, and that just seemed like a lot of effort. I know, yeah, Knight Rider also has a lot of ridiculous special effects and missiles and stuff, but I don't know. Knight Rider is almost, it is a car at the end of the day, whereas Back to the Future is not really about the car as such, at least not to the extent that Knight Rider is about its car. Anyway, that was the muse for that, really. So then I had this, I wanted to have the queue kind of do this kind of like, you know, the artificial lengthening of queues is not just a path. They often double back on themselves again and again to allow more room. And I thought, what am I going to do here? So I initially thought about doing some sort of gazebo or pavilion and just very generically themed. But then I thought, you know, let's kind of keep the Knight Rider aesthetic. What square-shaped buildings are associated with cars? I thought about this for a good 10 seconds before realizing that garages are big, square, blocky buildings that are associated with cars. So I decided to make like a garage. I've never actually seen Knight Rider, so I don't actually know if there is a garage. But again, I Google image searched to Knight Rider garage, and there was no immediately obvious photograph that kept repeating itself. So I thought, let's just take some liberties and just design any old garage and put a Knight Rider car in there. So it's fairly minimalist and basic because, you know, I'm lazy, and also I think that for the park's purposes, they wouldn't spend that long theming the inside. They probably would, actually. I'm just trying to justify my laziness. So most garages, well, all garages in fact, have like a platform that the cars can be raised up on so you can inspect the underbelly. It's not completely realistic in the sense that I have this car sitting on a grid, whereas in reality we'll be sitting on rails, but I have no justification for this. I think it was a bit of an oversight. I wasn't really thinking it through, and I was saying but to try and come up with an excuse there and then, but I didn't, and now this is all very awkward. So here I am just playing around. One of my favorite things about watching other Planet Coaster YouTubers is watching them spend a good 5 minutes flicking through thousands of scenery pieces trying to find stuff that fits. So a lot of the time you might see sudden cuts and weird jumps in my Planet Coaster series. It's because I was trying to find a scenery piece and couldn't decide on one, so I was just flicking through all of them trying to find one that looked vaguely okay with the general aesthetic of what I'm trying to build. So yeah, I was just playing around there. I eventually found things I liked. I used fences quite a lot in the construction of this, but not as fences. For example, I constructed the platform that the car sits on and the platform for the spare tyres, which aren't actually the correct tyres, and I haven't actually built it yet, so I'm kind of spoiling the commentary as before it's even happened, but I built them out of fences. And here's some fences that I am using as fences. You can tell I'm struggling to come up with things to talk about here as I'm just blankly staring at the screen trying to go over it. But people have said, I'm getting a bit faster. I know I'm talking too fast when I can feel myself tripping over my own words. But yeah, people have said that they like the laid-back, casual talking tone of this series, which is good because I'm too lazy to do anything better than that. I'll occasionally do some minimal research and I have my phone on in front of me, and so I'll have the Wikipedia article of what I'm talking about in front of me, and then I'll just kind of flick through the key facts and pretend that I've done research for a video. Just noticed, actually, I had a quick sip of water, so I paused my commentary just then and just rewound it to make sure there were no sudden jumps or anything in the cuts between takes, because these videos, I don't actually record these commentaries in one giant take. It's usually about 4 or 5 takes, because I'll have to like stop to take a sip of water, or just, you know, consider where I've gone wrong in life. So it's not always a seamless, it's never a seamless commentary. So I just rewound then and realized I started talking about my PC was getting loud and it was very dusty, but then never finished what I wanted to talk about there. And that's because it's been currently running since Thursday, non-stop pretty much, because I had to, let me think, it was Thursday. Yeah, it was Thursday, because I've been rendering the full Green Harvest movie. So Green Harvest, for those that don't know, I do a series on this channel called Kerbal Space Program. It's this video game where you go into space and you play as little creatures called Kerbals. It's pretty good. I would definitely recommend considering checking it out if that sounds like your sort of thing. But I've been making a series called Green Harvest, which is like a machinima series, and that wrapped up last week. And I've been doing, as is tradition for my films, as in I've done 3 so far, and I've done this, well, I've done 3 now, but the previous 2 I've done prior to me finishing my 3rd one. What I did was I made one long video that is a combination of all of them. What's the easiest and most obvious way of doing this would be to take there are 9 episodes, so I'll take the 9 MP4s of each episode and then just merge them all into one Sony Vegas file and render it out, and which would probably take about an hour to render that. But MP4 files, it's a bit like JPEGs, right? Every time you render a file as an MP4, a little bit of quality is lost. So if you were to take an MP4 file and then re-render it as an MP4 file, and then take that and re-render it, eventually you would be left with this like garbled, pixelated mess. So to minimize this, I just took the raw footage and like the raw Vegas files and re-rendered them. However, Green Harvest has a lot of video tracks in Sony Vegas, so it's not really feasible for me to, copy and paste each individual video track and reconstruct the whole thing in one Vegas file. And I think the risk of me making an error in copying something over or something getting missed would be quite high. So what I did was I just imported, you can import Sony Vegas files as like media, but what happens is when you're rendering a file and you're re-render, so if you import a Vegas file, it essentially takes twice as long to render pretty much. Like it has to render it before it processes it, then it renders it again. I'm not quite sure the exact specifics of how it works or why this works, but it essentially doubles the length. So Green Harvest episodes typically take up to about 2.5 hours to render. There are 9 episodes, so you can quickly see how it's going to take a very long time to render. So at the moment, so I had to render it. It took about 36 hours to render the entire film. But the actual film itself is not completely identical to the series, because the series has episode cards. Like it says, Matt Lowne presents, and a couple of seconds later it will say Green Harvest, episode X, what X being the number of the episode. However, when I was editing the film, I went through all the Vegas files and removed the Matt Lowne presents and the Green Harvest title cards, except obviously for the very first episode, because that would just be the title card for the film rather than an episode. But as I was rewatching it, for episode 9, I forgot to cut out the Matt Lowne presents, and me being a bit of a perfectionist, I was like, well, this will never do. So I had to render the entire thing again. So overall, Green Harvest took about 70 hours for the whole film to render, which I know by some YouTuber standards like Rocket Jump is not actually a very long amount of time. I think they've done videos that have taken like 78 hours to render. Not 78 hours, I think their 3D Mario video, the 3D versions in the Anaglyph one, took 128 hours to render. I don't know why. 128 hours to render. I'm not sure why I remember that weird, oddly specific fact, but there you go. I remember it taking a very long time to render. So, but I think still, it's a very long time for my computer to render a video, given the length it normally takes to render stuff. So that's why my PC is also probably getting a little bit dustier quite exponentially, because it's been running so long at full whack. Because again, rendering a file is not like just displaying a picture or uploading a YouTube video. It's fully using its CPU. Like my RAM usage has been pretty much in the high 90s for the past several days non-stop, because Sony Vegas knows how to use, like Sony Vegas will just eat RAM for breakfast and lunch and dinner. I have 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is overkill for most people, but I'm very often using all of it because I do a lot of rendering and Photoshop and stuff like that. So that's another reason why my computer has been rather loud recently. But there you go, that's pretty much the end of that thought process. And we're coming towards the end of this video. Here I am just very briefly talking about what I'm doing on screen, if it wasn't obvious. this track actually removed some of the supports for Bloodhawk, and it kind of looked a bit dumb having that massive bit of track completely unsupported. So the spacing between this custom support and all the other ones is a bit larger than normal, but I think it's buyable given that this support's kind of structure is far more substantial than the other ones. It doesn't look quite right. It looks a bit weird, and that's because the actual pole that holds it up, I couldn't do it vertical straight down because that would just go into the actual racetrack itself. So I built it slanted, but then that looked a bit weird. So I then built another like offshoot of it to kind of make an arch shape, if that makes sense. I mean, it might not be very realistic, I don't know, but I think it looked okay, and I think it kind of looks a little bit cool. It's like a unique appearance to these supports. I really do innovate the industry with this series, to be honest. I think people at Intamin are definitely taking notes about how to structure their supports in future. So Intamin, if you're planning to build a go-kart track, or if someone's trying to build a go-kart track under your coaster and you need to rework one of the supports, here you go. You're welcome. I charge £78 per bolt that's used to copy one of my designs, and you know, you'll have to be paying royalties to me forever. So, but I hope this was helpful in your design and construction. If you work for Intamin, leave a comment below. You know, well, that's it. That's the end of the commentary. Gosh, that was getting awkward towards the end, but we got there, guys. We got there. Well done. Pat yourself on the back. Here are some little shots. I can't show you a POV because the park is not open and you can't just drive around yourself, which Frontier, you know, come on, fix, please. That would be a really cool feature to have. But regardless, on screen in a second, in 3, 2, 1. Awesome links for you to look at, including a link to the full series. If you enjoyed this playlist, if you enjoyed this video, you may enjoy your other videos like it. So there's a link to the playlist. And the other one is just one that was chosen for you by YouTube's algorithm. Twitter, Discord, and Patreon are in the description and on screen. Like, comment, and subscribe. The video is nearly over, and now it's over. Goodbye.